Hello, good evening. Welcome to this week's module in Introduction to Gender Studies, which is called Performing Ourselves. Um, Now, as I'm kind of getting everything squared up and ready to go, I do want to apologize for running just a tiny bit late this evening. My oldest daughter and I were taking just an evening walk after dinner, and the walk was really awesome. There we go. But we saw a lot of really amazing things, which was nice, but it slowed us down. So when I walked in the door, my spouse and I were like, okay, let's go. It's time for bed. Like, let's get the kids in bed because Rachel's got a thing tonight. Uh, like just chit-chatting here a little bit, but that's kind of how the evening goes sometimes. Um, but honestly, 100% worth it. Uh, Now, I guess just usual ground rules as we're getting rolling here. Again, my name is Rachel Hansen. I'm your teacher for the next, well, shoot, at this point, I think it's 10 weeks for Introduction to Gender and Women's Studies. I am really glad that you are here, and I welcome any questions that you have or any comments that you have, with the caveat that those comments aren't really, frankly, related to my appearance in any way. We're here to learn. We're not here to comment on each other's bodies. Um, and this has happened before. Possibly it will happen again, but I will call you out in the stream if you make a comment like that. So you don't need the embarrassment. I don't need to call you out. Just don't comment on anybody's bodies, okay? Like, we all know what we look like. Now, really talking about gender performance is kind of one of my favorite things to talk about within the discipline of gender and women's studies. And one of the reasons that it is something that's really exciting to me to talk about is because I get to pull in one of my absolute favorite genres, and that is science fiction. Uh, Now, when I very first was learning about this as an undergraduate student, um, Halo was still very much like a video game universe, right? Like, been around the block more than once. And so, right, like the shows didn't come out. I think even when I was first starting learning about this concept, like Red versus Blue hadn't even come out yet. Uh, like Halo is very solidly a video game universe with books. Um, but within that universe, we have figures that, if you are also familiar with Halo, you actually at this point, maybe even if you're not familiar with Halo, that you are familiar with uh, the sentient AIs that guide the Spartans. Um, Now, you might, if you're not familiar with the broader Halo universe, you have almost certainly heard of Cortana, because Windows also now uses Cortana as their uh, AI in just like the regular world that we are living in. But there are other AIs within the Halo universe, like Serena, for example. But the reason that these AI are notable is because they choose their appearance. Now, within kind of the lore of the universe, they are brain scans of actual people, but they take on their own sentience and they choose their own appearance. And within Halo, this is super interesting, because we do see AI who are guiding the Spartans and that are guiding warships in their campaign against the Covenant, who choose an entirely non-humanoid form. And I'm thinking of characters like Black Box, and that's kind of a deep cut, but if you know, you know. And so, like, that's really interesting, right? That we have in the popular culture that we consume, there are characters that are relatively well fleshed out who make the decision to present themselves in a very specific way. And that way might not match up with the actual person that they, or like the actual human being that they are based on. And that's pretty interesting. Now, more recently, within popular culture, there's been another character um, out of Star Trek Prodigy, which maybe you watched that show on Paramount before they were giant idiots, and they canceled it, and it moved on to Netflix, which those of us with young kids were extremely grateful that Netflix did that. Um, and within the Star Trek universe, there's a species of beings called Medusans, and they are non-corporeal beings who are very dedicated to space travel. And within the story that Prodigy is telling, there's a Medusan who is a key member of our group of heroes. Their name is Zero, and they talk very often, both within their crew and within the larger universe and other folks that they encounter on their journey. Uh, that Medusans are, as a result of being non corporeal, uh, they also are genderless. So they're using gender neutral pronouns. Um, maybe I think this is a little funny. Hopefully, it comes across as a little funny. But within the Star Trek universe, if a corporeal being, so somebody like us, lays eyes on a Medusan, they fully lose their entire mind. Like like their mind is just gone. Um, and there are some spaces where I think that our trans brothers and sisters may have a similar impact on um, folks that are a little bit more on the right. Um, but thankfully kind of, I don't know. It's a choice though, right? And it's something that we can move past from, which is not necessarily the case with the Medusans. Um, but right, like within popular culture, we do have these beings that give us an example of what it could be like to make a different choice on how we're presenting ourselves. And it is uh, really within this that we get to our first article of the week, which is uses of the erotic. Now, I want to pause here for just a minute, um, because most of us don't really encounter the word erotic outside of a sexual context. And you might be feeling a little bit uncomfortable right now, and that's okay. But we're gonna just take a deep breath. Ooh. Now, this article, Uses of the Erotic, was written by Audre Lorde, who honestly is one of my absolute favorite feminist scholars. Um, and if I had to explain why the word erotic feels so loaded, I would honestly borrow her words. And I quote, in order to perpetuate itself, every oppression must corrupt or distort those various sources of power within the culture of the oppressed that can provide energy for change. For women, this has meant a suppression of the erotic as a considered source of power and information within our lives. And so, with this, we really start to learn and understand that eroticism is not only sexual energy. It's also just the energy that fuels and informs how we're moving through life, and how we feel about things and how we respond to things. Um, Eroticism really is the beginning of our sense of self, uh, and our ability to navigate the chaos of our strongest feelings. Um, and so, if we can really like tap into our innate eroticism and recognize that it's not just sexual, um, we really start to realize that we hold a lot of power over ourselves, and that we have a choice to direct our energy towards chosen outcomes, and to make kind of those course corrections as we pay attention to how we're feeling along the way. Um, Now, another part of the reason that I want to really kind of start with eroticism as kind of a means of how we present ourselves, um, and really perform uh, how we want to show up in the world, is because kind of the flattening of the term as a sexual term does an incredible disservice to all of us. That very narrow framing strips away the real power that all of us have. Um, right? Because if you are considering another person as solely a sexual being because they have tried to tap into their eroticism, um, that reduces your ability, right, to take them seriously, and to see what they have to offer. Um, but it also reduces them, and that's not fair either. Uh, so really, like when we think about how we generally perform eroticism, uh, the result is a society where we perform our genders in ways that disempower almost everybody. Um, and I didn't do this on purpose, but a very recent example that is kind of hitting me right in the chest right now, um, is an experience that I actually had a little bit earlier today. I was My kids are just making a lot of appearances in today's lecture. Um, I was getting my son off of the bus this afternoon. Um, Unfortunately, for all involved, the people driving around the bus were not driving very safely. Uh, and my son's bus driver got into a verbal shouting match with one of the drivers. Um, it was scary for me, because I think that we all know, right, for a lot of reasons, a couple of men fighting with each other can be a pretty intimidating scenario. It was also scary for my son, who was stuck on the bus with his bus driver in a shouting match, with a stranger. Uh, and in this moment, in this power struggle, where I was also inserting myself, because honestly, like, I just wanted to get my kid off the bus, right? Um, None of us, and I am including myself in this, were behaving in ways that is would generally be considered to be um, decent or full of decorum. Um, but it's in those moments, right, where you realize that you have lost the ability to control and empower yourself, that you do a disservice to everyone around you. Um, Now, so as we are kind of thinking about, shoot, I thought I still had water in my water bottle. I do not. Um, anyway, as we really do start to think about um, kind of that feeling in our bodies and how we are moving from being an erotic being to just equating to sexuality to uh, an erotic being is a person who is in touch with their feelings and how they feel in time and in space. Um, we get to move on then to our next um, assigned piece of content, uh, which is an episode of Benchtopia called Panic at the Gender Performance. Now, Binch, and that's Binchtopia, um, is hosted by Julia Heva and Eliza McClam. They do a really beautiful job in Panic at the Gender Performance, um, really talking about another feminist theory, or forgive me, feminist theorist, Judith Butler. Um, Now, I appreciate the work that they did because while I um, also appreciate Judith Butler, there are pockets of queer theory that are really jargon heavy, and I have a hard time getting through them. Now, I have my own theories about uh, why that is the case, but I think that's a different conversation for another day. Um, but it was this episode that really, really helped made me appreciate what Julia and Eliza do. Um, Now, Chris, as I previously discussed, the word erotic can make you feel really uncomfortable. Um, and just as that is the case, talking about gender performance might make you think of like a literal stage. Uh, and sometimes that is the case in the modern world that we live in, right? Like you might be thinking about drag queens or drag kings who are absolutely performing gender on an actual stage um, in a really delightful and bombastic way that I find to be really great. um, but that's not really what Judith Butler is talking about when she talks about gender performance. Um, it's a little bit more, um, I believe, I believe it was Shakespeare that said that all the world's a stage. And so when we're talking about gender performance, we're talking about it in more of like a Shakespearean way. Um, the irony is not lost on me, right? That um, there was a lot of gender bending happening um, in Shakespeare, but uh, really the idea is that the world that we live on is essentially a stage, um, and that that's really what makes it quite insidious. But because we are, um, so I'll pause myself for a second. If you hear that tapping noise, that's just because I'm kind of kicking my feet against the footrest. I'll get the wiggles a little bit. Anyway, um, right, gender performance really is extremely insidious, and it's insidious because um, we all make it real every single day uh, by acting in very specific ways that are both informed by our culture and informed by our own innate sense of self. And also by having those actions accepted by those around us. So, gender really is something that we are creating constantly and together in real time. Now, that's why I can perform my gender um, as a cisgendered woman while wearing pants, for example, where my great grandmother absolutely could not have done that. Right? My great grandmother probably would have been arrested for wearing pants because that was not a socially acceptable way to perform your femininity in the early 1900s. Um, but there's so many ways, right, that we uh, really do choose to perform gender. Um, and it might be a choice that you make. It might also be a social norm that is kind of foisted upon you. Um, now, shoot, I hope you forgive me. I was a podcast guest on a show a couple of years ago. I have forgotten the name of the show. It's a little embarrassing. Um, but we were talking about being queer in a capitalist society. Um, and that part of the reason that being a trans person and performing your chosen gender can be really difficult is, forgive me, I thought a comment popped up, but no, it wasn't a comment. Um, because performing your gender in a capitalist society um, can be pretty tricky, right? Now, um, I, as a person who was assigned female as birth, and that feels very authentic to me, right? Um, Nobody else can tell you what feels authentic to you. Um, but, obviously you can tell yourself. But um, so as a cisgendered woman, frankly, there's not a ton that I really need to do to perform my gender. Right? Like most of the time, actually, I'm gonna say most of the time, all of the time, right? People look at me and they go, "Oh, that person is a woman," and it doesn't matter really that I'm not wearing makeup, which I generally prefer not to do because I have pretty sensitive skin, uh, or that I have my hair done in a specific way, right? Like none of that. Like none of that really matters. Um, for a transgender person, uh, largely for their own safety because they're um, trying to live within social norms that are not built for safety. Um, and that this week is a really difficult thing to talk about. I'm going to say this week specifically. It's difficult every week. Um, but um, a trans person might more likely have to participate in a capitalist society because, right, like a transgender woman definitely does have to wear makeup. They have to perform to um, those social expectations to have any kind of a hope, generally, of physical safety. And so when we're talking about performance, we're really talking about all of those things, right? How you're showing up in the world, how you feel in your body, and how other people also expect you to show up in the world. Uh, and some of us are really lucky and we don't have to explain how we're showing up in the world, and others are not as lucky. Uh, Now, kind of the last piece of media that I really wanted to make sure to talk about this week is the Dove Real Beauty ad. Now, which you, of course, can click on the link and watch. Um, and when I say click on the link, I mean the link in this week's written module. Um, and I really wanted to bring in this piece of media for a couple of reasons. Um, Now, the first is I think it's generally a pretty good ad, right? To talk about what um, like real beauty can mean. Um, the second reason, though, is really to kind of highlight how messy and complicated feminism can be at times. Um, Now, in my view, feminism is its most pure and radical um, and transformative, right? It's all of the things when it incorporates anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. Um, Both of those belief systems rest on the belief that capitalism harms people and the planet. Um, and I believe that that is true. Capitalism does do those things. However, this Dove ad which was talking about beauty norms and like how people can feel beautiful in the skin that they are in, um, is really a reminder that gender performance is deeply personal and it's rooted in our bodies. This ad is also one that sends a message that our lives matter. They matter deeply, and that our bodies and our minds have value. Um, and also, this is an ad that comes from a corporation that profits within a capitalist system. Um, I would offer to you, though, the perspective that um, they're profiting from a global capitalist system that ultimately disenfranchises most people. Um, also has a strong responsibility and obligation to repair the harm that they cause, and the harm that they cause to our bodies, to our psyches, and to the environment. Um, and I don't mean this unkindly, but broadly, um, it can be really difficult for a lot of us to hold kind of two opposing ideas together in our own minds. Um, that capitalism is harmful and that a corporation can and should provide a meaningful feminist message to repair the harm that they have done. Um, it, and like all of these things are really part of engaging with feminism in a nuanced way. Um, Now, I didn't get any questions this week, but I would love to hear how has thinking about gender presentation impacted you? Um, and how has it shown up in your life? And if you're thinking about this for the first time, welcome. Um, I really hope that you find thinking about this to be compelling and rewarding. Um, because this maybe is just a little bit too right, like woo woo, but I do believe that really thoughtfully identifying how we're performing our gender, and the impact that it has on those around us is critically important to building the world that we want to live in. Uh, and I think that being able to articulate that, particularly in the United States, at least in the extreme violence that we have witnessed in the last several weeks, um, is I don't think it's possible to overstate its importance, honestly. Um, right? Because if we want to take a look at how society expects us to perform femininity and masculinity, um, we need to take a look at those real world impacts on the world that we are living in, because they're not great, right? Uh, but I do truly believe that we have the opportunity to turn that around, and to identify how um, the ways that we are showing up in the world um, both impact us and those around us. Um, Now that really is all that I have for you this week. So thank you so much for joining me, and I will look forward to seeing you. I'm just thinking of the calendar here. Next Tuesday, September 23rd, where we will be having a conversation about. I'm just checking here. Um, like whose voices get heard, and how that shapes our sense of equity and justice, as we continue to kind of develop our own feminist identities. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you next week, and I hope you have a great week. Bye.